The hardest goodbye I ever faced was not when I lost someone. It was when I realized the people who were supposed to stand beside me had already decided to walk away. I still remember the sound of that cold November evening, the quiet street outside my parents' house, and the small hands of my two daughters holding onto mine as we stood there with everything we owned packed into a few bags. My name is Nathan Walker, and before that night, I believed family meant there would always be a place for you when life became impossible. I was wrong. 8 years ago, my world changed when my wife passed away unexpectedly, leaving me to raise my daughters, Lily and Sophie, on my own. Lily was only 4 years old, and Sophie was barely 2. They were too young to understand why their mother was gone, and I was still trying to understand how I was supposed to become both parents overnight. I did not ask anyone to fix my life. I did not ask for money or comfort. I only hoped my parents would give us a temporary place to stay while I rebuilt everything. I thought my childhood home would be the one door that would never close on me. I was standing on their front porch with Lily holding my jacket and Sophie resting against my shoulder when I knocked. When my father, Robert, opened the door, I saw something in his expression that I never expected. It was not sadness. It was hesitation. Behind him stood my mother, Margaret, watching silently from the hallway. I told them I was not looking for a permanent solution. I explained that I would find work, save money, and get us back on our feet. I just needed a little time. My father looked away before answering. He said they had already built their retirement life and did not want the responsibility of raising children again. Those words stayed with me because I was not asking them to raise my daughters. I was asking them to help their own son during the hardest season of his life. My mother stepped closer and said something I never forgot. She told me that sometimes people had to learn how to survive without expecting others to rescue them. I looked down at Lily and Sophie and forced myself to stay calm. My daughters did not need to see me break. I thanked my parents for listening, even though there was nothing left to say. Then I picked up our bags, held my daughters' hands, and walked back to my car. That night, we stayed at a small motel 20 minutes away with a leaking window and a tiny room that barely fit 3 people. Lily asked me if we were going to have a home again. I remember sitting beside her bed, holding back my own tears, and telling her something I needed to believe myself. I told her that home was not only a place. Home was the people who loved you, protected you, and stayed when life became difficult. I did not know it then, but that painful night would become the beginning of a completely different life. A life where my daughters and I would learn how strong we could become together. A life where we would build something my parents never expected. A family built not from promises, but from the people who chose to remain. The following months tested every promise I had made to my daughters that night in the motel. Every morning began before sunrise because I had learned that survival depended on using every hour the day offered. I accepted a warehouse job during the early morning shift and spent my evenings delivering groceries throughout the city after picking Lily and Sophie up from daycare. There were nights when I barely slept 4 hours, but every time exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, I looked at my daughters and remembered why giving up was never an option. We eventually moved from the motel into a small 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. It was not much. The paint on the walls was faded, the kitchen was barely large enough for one person, and the heating system made strange noises every winter. But when I unlocked that apartment for the first time, Lily smiled as though we had just entered a mansion. She ran from room to room, laughing before turning back toward me. "Daddy, this is our home now." I nodded with a smile because she was right. It was ours. Every piece of furniture came from thrift stores, neighborhood yard sales, or generous donations from local charities. I spent weekends repairing old tables, painting shelves, and building simple beds with secondhand materials. The apartment slowly became warm not because of expensive decorations, but because every improvement represented another small victory. Lily loved helping me arrange books on homemade shelves, while little Sophie proudly carried plastic cups to the kitchen cabinets as though she were completing an important mission. Those ordinary moments reminded me that happiness was never measured by how much money we had. It was measured by how safe my daughters felt each night before falling asleep. Even during our hardest months, I refused to speak badly about my parents in front of the girls. They occasionally asked why Grandma and Grandpa never visited. I simply told them that sometimes adults make choices that are difficult to understand. I wanted my daughters to grow up with kindness in their hearts rather than bitterness. Carrying resentment would only create another burden they did not deserve. One afternoon, Lily came home from elementary school with a drawing she had made during class. It showed 3 stick figures standing beneath a bright blue sky. She handed it to me proudly and pointed to each person. "This is you. This is Sophie. This is me." The teacher asked us to draw our family. I noticed there was plenty of empty space on the paper. I asked if she wanted to add anyone else. She looked at the picture for a moment before quietly shaking her head. "The people who love us are already here." Her answer stayed with me long after she went to bed that evening. Children often understand the truth more clearly than adults because they see actions instead of excuses. As time passed, I earned a promotion at the warehouse after my supervisor noticed I never missed a shift and always volunteered for additional responsibilities. The extra income allowed me to reduce my evening deliveries and spend more time with Lily and Sophie. We created small traditions that cost almost nothing. Friday nights became homemade pizza nights. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like funny animals. Every Sunday afternoon, we visited the public library together, where my daughters filled reusable bags with books while I searched for business guides and professional certifications that could help me build a better future. Those quiet afternoons became the foundation of everything that followed. I slowly realized that although my parents had closed one door, life had quietly opened another. It was leading us toward a future built not on comfort that had been handed to us, but on resilience we earned together one ordinary day at a time. 5 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined. The tiny apartment that once felt like our greatest victory eventually became too small for the life we were building. Thanks to my promotion and countless evenings studying business management after the girls went to sleep, I found the confidence to start a small residential repair company. At first, it was only me, an old pickup truck, and a toolbox filled with equipment I had collected piece by piece. I accepted every honest job I could find, whether it was repairing fences, replacing drywall, painting kitchens, or fixing broken decks. Word slowly spread because I treated every customer's home with the same care I gave my own. Before long, I hired my first employee, then another. The business grew steadily, not because of luck, but because every difficult year had taught me the value of showing up, keeping promises, and working harder than anyone expected. By the time Lily turned 12 and Sophie celebrated her 10th birthday, we had moved into a comfortable 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and a small backyard. The first evening after moving in, the girls raced through every room laughing with excitement before running outside to claim corners of the yard for future flower gardens and summer games. I stood on the back porch watching them chase each other beneath the setting sun, realizing that every exhausting shift, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice had quietly led us to that moment. We had finally built the home I promised them years earlier. The greatest reward was not the house itself. It was seeing the girls grow into kind, confident young people. Lily loved reading and dreamed of becoming a teacher because she wanted children to feel encouraged every day. Sophie had developed an endless curiosity about science and spent weekends performing harmless experiments on the kitchen table with baking soda, vinegar, and colorful food coloring. Their laughter filled every room, replacing memories of uncertainty with a sense of peace I once believed was impossible. Even though our lives had become more comfortable, one subject rarely entered our conversations. My parents remained completely absent. They never called on birthdays. They never mailed holiday cards. They never asked about their granddaughters. As painful as that reality had once been, time gradually transformed it into something quieter. The absence stopped feeling like an open wound and became simply another chapter of our history. One evening, while helping Lily with a school assignment about family history, she looked at me thoughtfully. "Daddy, do Grandma and Grandpa know where we live now?" I paused before answering honestly. "They probably could find us if they wanted to." Lily nodded slowly. "Then maybe they made their choice a long time ago." Her words carried no anger, only quiet understanding. I realized my daughters had grown up without resentment because they judged people by actions rather than titles. To them, family meant the people who consistently showed up. A few weeks later, our neighborhood hosted a community picnic at the local park. As I watched Lily and Sophie laughing with friends beneath bright summer skies, several neighbors approached me to compliment how respectful and compassionate the girls had become. Hearing those words filled me with pride unlike anything money could ever provide. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, I walked through the quiet house turning off lights before stopping beside a framed photograph of the three of us taken shortly after moving into our new home. Looking at that picture, I realized something important. My parents had believed closing their door would protect the peaceful retirement they wanted. Instead, that painful decision unknowingly pushed me toward building a stronger, healthier family than I had ever imagined. I smiled quietly before heading upstairs, completely unaware that the past I believed had finally been left behind was already making its way back toward our front door. The quiet life we had built continued for another 3 years without interruption. Lily was now 15, Sophie had just turned 13, and our home had become the gathering place for school projects, birthday celebrations, and weekend dinners with neighbors who had slowly become close friends. Sometimes I caught myself wondering whether life had finally decided to reward us for everything we had endured. Then one ordinary Tuesday evening, the doorbell rang just as we were sitting down to eat dinner. Lily stood to answer it, but I smiled and told her I would get the door. I had no reason to expect anything unusual. When I opened it, time seemed to stop. Standing on my front porch were my parents. Robert looked noticeably older than I remembered. His shoulders had begun to sag, and his once confident posture had been replaced by uncertainty. Margaret held a worn handbag tightly with both hands, avoiding my eyes for several seconds before finally looking up. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument ever could. For a brief moment, I was no longer standing in front of my own home. I was back on their porch years earlier with 2 frightened little girls and nowhere to go. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived, and I calmly stepped outside, gently closing the front door behind me. I did not want Lily and Sophie hearing a conversation they were not prepared for. "Nathan," my father finally said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "We know this is unexpected." I nodded but said nothing. My mother looked around the neighborhood before speaking. "You have done well for yourself." It was an obvious statement, yet hearing it from her felt strangely empty. She had not witnessed the years of struggle that made this home possible. She had not seen the nights when I worked until exhaustion or the mornings when I packed school lunches before sunrise. She only saw the finished result. My father cleared his throat. "Could we talk for a few minutes?" I considered the request carefully before inviting them to sit on the front porch instead of coming inside. Something inside me was not ready to open that door completely. We sat facing the quiet street, while children rode bicycles in the distance and sprinklers watered nearby lawns. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood stood in sharp contrast to the tension between us. After another long silence, my father admitted they had tried to find me several months earlier but did not know where I lived until someone from their old church mentioned seeing my company truck around town. That explanation raised more questions than answers. If they had truly wanted to find me before, they could have done so years earlier. My mother seemed to recognize the doubt on my face. "We should have come sooner," she admitted softly. "We know that." I remained calm. "Why now?" The question hung in the air. Neither of them answered immediately. Instead, they exchanged a brief glance that suggested they had rehearsed this conversation many times but still struggled to begin. Finally, my father looked directly at me. "Things have changed." Those 3 words carried more weight than he probably realized. I studied their tired expressions, their modest clothing, and the aging sedan parked across the street. Something about their appearance told me life had not unfolded the way they expected after turning us away all those years ago. Before anyone could continue, the front door opened behind me. Lily stepped onto the porch holding a glass pitcher of iced tea. She smiled politely before noticing the unfamiliar faces sitting beside me. "Dad?" she asked quietly. "Are these friends of yours?" I looked from my daughter's gentle expression to my parents waiting anxiously for my answer. After everything that had happened, I realized this was the moment the past and the present had finally collided, and whatever I said next would shape every conversation that followed. The moment I introduced my parents to Lily and Sophie was one I had imagined many times, but never in the way it actually happened. I had spent years wondering what I would say if Robert and Margaret ever returned. I thought I might feel anger. I thought I might finally ask every question I had carried since that night on their porch. Instead, I felt something much more complicated. I felt the weight of time. I looked at my daughters standing beside me, and I realized they were not the same little girls who had held my hands while we searched for a place to sleep. They were teenagers now, confident, and kind, and they had built their understanding of family through the people who showed up for them every day. "These are my parents," I finally said. Lily looked surprised but polite. Sophie quietly smiled and offered them a greeting. They had heard stories about their grandparents over the years, but I had always been careful not to fill their minds with resentment. I wanted them to form their own opinions based on their own experiences. My parents seemed overwhelmed by the moment. My mother looked at the girls as if she was trying to imagine all the years she had missed. My father asked them about school, their interests, and their plans for the future. The conversation remained respectful, but there was an invisible distance between everyone. The next morning, my parents returned and asked if we could talk privately. This time I invited them inside, but we sat in the living room instead of the kitchen where family conversations usually happened. I wanted the setting to remain calm. I did not want the past to turn into an argument. My father looked around the room at the photographs on the walls. There were pictures from birthdays, vacations, school events, and simple moments that showed a life they had not been part of. "You built something beautiful," he said quietly. I nodded. I had to. That sentence seemed to affect both of them. My mother lowered her eyes before speaking. "Nathan, we know we hurt you." Hearing those words from her was something I had once wished for, but now it did not feel as satisfying as I expected. The pain had changed over the years. It was no longer something I carried every day. It was simply a memory of a person I used to be. "Why did you come back?" I asked again. This time my father answered honestly. He explained that after years of living comfortably, their circumstances had changed. Retirement had not gone as planned. Unexpected expenses had reduced their savings, and they had begun facing difficult decisions about their future. They had reached out to old friends, but many had their own challenges. Eventually, they realized the family they had once pushed away was the only connection they had left. My mother became emotional as she admitted something I never expected to hear. "We thought you needed us more than we needed you," she said. "We were wrong." I listened carefully, but I did not rush to comfort them. Understanding someone's regret does not erase the impact of their choices. I wanted them to know that. "When you closed that door on me," I said calmly, "I had two little girls who needed me to keep moving forward. I did not have time to stay hurt. I had to become everything they needed." My father nodded slowly. There was no excuse in his expression, only recognition. For the first time, they seemed to understand that my success was not proof that their decision had been harmless. It was proof that I had survived despite it. Before they left that afternoon, my mother asked if there was any chance we could rebuild a relationship. I looked through the window at Lily and Sophie laughing together in the backyard. My answer would not only affect me, it would affect the family I had spent years protecting. I knew forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Forgiveness could begin with one conversation, but trust would have to be earned one choice at a time. After my parents left that afternoon, I did not immediately decide what would happen next. Some choices deserve time because they affect more than one person. That evening, after dinner, Lily and Sophie helped clear the table before we settled into the living room together. They both knew something important had happened. Teenagers notice far more than adults sometimes realize. Lily was the first to speak. "Dad, were they really your parents?" I nodded. "Yes." Sophie looked thoughtful rather than upset. "Why have we never met them before?" I took a slow breath because they deserved honesty without placing the weight of old mistakes on their shoulders. "Years ago, after your mother passed away, I asked them for temporary help while we got back on our feet. They chose not to help us. Since then, we have lived separate lives." The room became quiet. Neither girl interrupted. They simply listened. Lily finally asked the question I knew would eventually come. "Are you angry?" I considered my answer carefully. I was angry for a long time. Then I became too busy building our life to stay angry forever. Eventually the anger faded, but I never forgot what happened. Sophie wrapped a blanket around her shoulders before asking softly, "Do you think they are sorry?" I looked toward the window where the evening sun was beginning to disappear. "I think they regret many things. Regret is real, but regret and rebuilding trust are not the same thing." The following afternoon, I agreed to meet my parents at a quiet coffee shop near the park. I wanted to continue the conversation somewhere neutral, away from my daughters. When I arrived, Robert and Margaret were already waiting. They looked nervous, as though they understood this might be their only opportunity to explain themselves completely. After we ordered coffee, my father spoke first. "Nathan, We have spent years telling ourselves that you eventually found your way and probably no longer needed us. That belief made it easier to avoid facing what we had done. My mother quietly added, "The truth is that we were ashamed. Every year that passed made it harder to reach out because we believed you would never want to hear from us again." I listened without interrupting. For the first time, they were not defending themselves or searching for excuses. They were simply admitting the truth. My father looked down at his hands. "When your wife died, we convinced ourselves that taking you and the girls into our home would change the retirement we had planned for decades. We chose our comfort instead of our family." Hearing him say those words aloud was painful, but it also removed every remaining uncertainty. There had never been a misunderstanding. There had never been hidden circumstances I failed to see. They had simply made the wrong choice. I remained calm before answering. "Do you know what I remember?" Both shook their heads. I remember Lily asking if we would ever have a home again. I remember Sophie falling asleep in a motel chair because the bed was too small for all three of us. I remember wondering how I would buy groceries the following week. Those are the memories your decision created. Neither of them could respond immediately. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she quietly whispered, "We cannot change any of that." "No," I answered gently. "You cannot." We sat together in silence for several moments before my father finally asked the question that mattered most. "Is there anything we can do now?" I looked at him carefully. Years earlier, I would have answered from pain. Now I answered from responsibility. "If there is ever any relationship between you and my daughters, it will happen slowly, honestly, and only if it makes them feel safe. Their well-being comes before everything else." My parents both nodded. For the first time since they returned, I felt they understood that this story was no longer about repairing their relationship with me. It was about whether they could earn the privilege of becoming part of a family that had already learned how to stand strong without them. The weeks that followed moved slowly, exactly the way I hoped they would. I did not rush my daughters into building a relationship with people they barely knew, and I did not rush my parents into believing that one apology could repair years of absence. Life had taught me that trust grows quietly through consistent actions rather than emotional promises. One Saturday morning, Robert called and asked if he could attend one of Lily's school choir performances. Before answering, I spoke with both of my daughters. I explained that the decision belonged to all of us, not just me. Lily surprised me with her maturity. "I am willing to let them come," she said, "but I do not want everyone pretending we have always been a happy family." Sophie nodded in agreement. "I just want people to be honest." Their answers reminded me once again why protecting them had always been the right choice. They were not asking for perfection. They were asking for truth. At the performance, my parents arrived early and quietly sat near the back of the auditorium. They did not try to draw attention to themselves or force conversation. They simply watched as Lily stood proudly with her classmates and sang with confidence. I noticed my mother wiping away tears several times during the concert. Whether those tears came from pride, regret, or both, I could not say. After the performance ended, Lily walked over to them on her own. She thanked them politely for coming. My father smiled gently and congratulated her without trying to hug her or overwhelm her with affection. It was a small interaction, but it respected the boundaries she needed. During the following month, similar moments slowly accumulated. My parents attended one of Sophie's science fairs and listened carefully as she explained her project. They mailed birthday cards instead of expensive gifts because they had finally understood that relationships could not be purchased. Sometimes they joined us for a short lunch at a local diner, and sometimes several weeks passed without seeing each other at all. Everything happened naturally instead of being forced. One evening, Lily and I were washing dishes together when she quietly asked, "Dad, why are you giving them another chance after everything they did?" I dried my hands before answering. "Because I want you and Sophie to see the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. Forgiveness frees our hearts from carrying bitterness forever. Forgetting would mean pretending the past never happened. I will never do that." Lily thought about those words before smiling softly. "I think I understand." A few days later, my parents invited me to visit their small apartment. The large house where I grew up had long since been sold. Their new home was simple, clean, and far more modest than the comfortable retirement they once protected so carefully. My father admitted they had downsized after several financial setbacks and poor investment decisions. Of us as grandparents, my mother said quietly, "That is their decision. We only wanted them to know that we are truly sorry for the years we missed. I accepted the letter without making promises. On the drive home, I realized something important. My parents were no longer asking me to erase the past. They were finally accepting responsibility for it. That change did not instantly restore trust, but it created the first real foundation upon which trust could someday grow. When I arrived home, Lily and Sophie were sitting on the front porch watching the sunset. I joined them without mentioning the letter immediately. We sat together in comfortable silence, and I realized that protecting my daughters had never meant keeping them away from every difficult situation. It meant teaching them how to face complicated emotions with wisdom, honesty, and compassion. Whatever happened next would not be decided by guilt or obligation. It would be decided by the peaceful family we had already built together, one careful choice at a time. Several months passed, and the rhythm of our lives settled into something that felt honest instead of forced. My parents never arrived without calling first. They never expected invitations, and they never assumed they had earned a permanent place in our home. In many ways, their patience spoke louder than their apologies ever could. They seemed to understand that every visit was a privilege rather than a right. One afternoon, my father called to tell me that my mother had recently experienced a minor health setback. It was not life-threatening, but it reminded both of them how quickly time moves forward. He asked if the girls would be willing to visit for an hour one weekend. Instead of answering for them, I brought the question to Lily and Sophie that evening. We sat together around the kitchen table, just as we always did whenever an important family decision needed to be made. Lily looked thoughtful before speaking. "I do not feel angry anymore," she admitted. "I just do not want anyone pretending the past never happened." Sophie nodded. "I think we can visit them. But I wanted to be because we choose to, not because anyone feels sorry." Hearing those words filled me with quiet pride. They had learned that compassion could exist alongside healthy boundaries. The following Saturday, we drove to my parents' apartment carrying a homemade apple pie the girls insisted on baking themselves. The apartment was modest but welcoming. My mother greeted the girls with a gentle smile instead of overwhelming emotion. She thanked them for coming and simply asked about school, their hobbies, and their plans for the summer. The conversation felt natural because no one tried to erase the years that had passed. During lunch, my father disappeared into the bedroom for a moment before returning with a small wooden box. He placed it on the table and slowly opened the lid. Inside were old family photographs, handwritten birthday cards, and several keepsakes from my childhood. "These belong to our family," he said quietly. "We should have shared them with you and the girls years ago. We cannot give back lost time, but we can give back the memories that should never have been hidden away." Lily carefully picked up one photograph showing me as a little boy standing between my parents during a camping trip. She smiled warmly before looking at me. "Dad, you look exactly like Sophie when you smile." Everyone laughed softly, and for the first time since my parents returned, the room felt lighter. Later that afternoon, my mother asked if she could speak with me privately on the apartment balcony. She looked out across the neighborhood before saying something I never expected. "Nathan, we know we may never become the grandparents we should have been. We accept that. We only hope the girls will always know that our greatest regret is not growing older. It is missing the chance to watch them grow up." I listened quietly before answering. "They know you regret it. What matters now is what you choose to do with the time you still have." She nodded with tears in her eyes, but did not ask for anything more. When we returned home that evening, Lily carried the wooden memory box inside and placed it carefully on the living room shelf beside our family photographs. She turned toward me with a peaceful smile. "It belongs here. Because it is part of your story," she said. Looking at that small wooden box resting among the memories we had created together, I realized our family had reached an important place. We had not erased the past, and we had not rewritten history. Instead, we had chosen something stronger. We had allowed truth, accountability, and compassion to exist together without sacrificing the safety, love, and trust that my daughters and I had spent years building. Nearly 3 years passed after my parents first returned to our lives, and the relationships between all of us settled into something neither perfect nor broken. It was honest. My parents never tried to reclaim the years they had lost because they finally understood that time could not be recovered. Instead, they focused on the moments still available to them. They attended school events when the girls invited them. They celebrated birthdays quietly with us. They called before visiting and respected every boundary that had been built over the years. That respect slowly became the strongest apology they could offer. By the time Lily graduated from high school, she stood on the stage with confidence that reminded me so much of her mother. As I watched her receive her diploma, I remembered the frightened little girl who once asked me inside a tiny motel room whether we would ever have a home again. I smiled because I finally knew the answer had never depended on a building. Home had been growing around us one decision at a time. Sophie stood beside me applauding louder than anyone in the audience, while my parents quietly wiped away tears from the second row. They understood that they had missed many milestones, but they were grateful not to miss this one. After the ceremony, Lily surprised all of us by asking for a photograph with every member of the family together. We stood beneath the bright summer sky smiling for the camera, and although the picture could never erase the past, it represented something just as meaningful. It showed people who had chosen honesty instead of pretending painful history never existed. A few weeks later, Lily prepared to leave for college. While packing her room, she found the old drawing she had made years earlier in elementary school. It was the simple picture with 3 stick figures beneath a blue sky. She smiled before taking out a pencil and carefully adding 2 more figures beside the others. I watched quietly as she finished. I thought there were only 3 people in our family back then, she said. Now I know families can grow, but only when everyone is willing to earn their place. She placed the drawing inside the same wooden memory box my father had given us months before. Seeing those 2 memories resting together felt symbolic. The past and the present no longer competed with each other. They had finally found peace inside the same story. One evening before Lily moved into her college dormitory, my father asked if he could speak with me alone. We sat on my back porch watching the sunset fade across the neighborhood where my daughters had grown up. He looked older than ever, but his voice carried a calm sincerity I had never heard during my childhood. "Nathan," he said quietly, "thank you for giving us more grace than we deserved." I looked toward the backyard where Sophie was laughing with friends and answered honestly, "I did not do it for you. I did it because I wanted my daughters to learn that protecting your peace does not require holding on to bitterness forever." My father nodded with understanding. Neither of us needed to say anything else. The lesson had already been learned. Years earlier, I believed my parents closing their front door had destroyed our future. Looking back, I realized that painful night had simply forced me to build a different one. My daughters grew up surrounded by love instead of resentment. They learned resilience instead of fear, compassion instead of revenge, and wisdom instead of anger. If my parents had opened their door all those years ago, perhaps life would have been easier for a while. But because they did not, I discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, and my daughters became remarkable young women whose kindness was never determined by the mistakes of others. Today, when people ask me what defines a family, I never mention blood, names, or shared history. I think about 2 little girls who trusted me when I had nothing except hope. And I remember that real family is built by the people who choose to stay, protect one another, accept responsibility for their choices, and keep showing up long after life becomes difficult. That is the home we created together, and no one can ever take it away.